Hello and good afternoon, everybody. If I can ask you all to please take your seats. And as we have people continuing to fill the room, if you are at the edges of your rows, if you could please move into the centers to make it easy for those who are still joining us. Welcome to the 2018 UCCS Economic Forum. My name is Samuel Thomas Elliott, and I am pleased to serve all of you as the Master of Ceremonies for today's event. 6 years ago, I arrived in Colorado Springs, brought here to play NCAA golf. Back then, all I knew of Colorado Springs is that it was a city south of Denver. Back then, all I knew of UCCS is that it was the University of Colorado that was not at Boulder. And back then, all that I knew of Chancellor Pam Shockley-Zalabak is that she was the woman in charge of running the 8,000 student university, UCCS at the time. Boy, oh boy, have things changed today. Today, Colorado Springs is a city on the rise, thriving with economic development and opportunity through growth. Today, I know UCCS as one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, providing an exceptional educational experience at a still affordable price. And today, I know Chancellor Emeritus Pam Shockley-Zalabak as a driver and a leader in the city of Colorado Springs that is behind many monumental past and present projects, including growing UCCS from 8,000 6 years ago to the 12,000 it sits at today. And of course, today, we sit in the 750-seat Shockley-Zalabak Theater to hear from the 2018 Women's Chamber Business Leader of the Year, Dr. Tatiana Bailey, and of course, our keynote. Before I begin, I'd like to ask all of you to continue to scoot into the middle. I still see some of you sitting on the edge. I know you're comfortable, but as you're scooting in, please take out your phones and take a selfie with your neighbor. The person in front of you, person behind you, feed that social media engine, and let's get the word out about how the things that we're going to learn during this event. As you're tweeting out those selfies and posting those selfies on Facebook, use the hashtag #EconForum. That is the same hashtag that we will have Lauren Hugg fielding tweets on Twitter to ask our speakers and our panelists throughout the event. Be sure to hold on to your tickets that had your seating assignment on it, because that is also a drink ticket for the networking we will be doing afterwards in the foyer. Those drink tickets are complimentary of Community Banks of Colorado. And last, we will announce the door prize, which is dinner at Hacienda, right across the street in University Village, at the end of the event, so be sure to stick around. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Venkat Reddy, Chancellor of UCCS.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam. How about a big round of applause for Sam, a proud graduate of UCCS. Well, thank you all, especially to the wonderful sponsors who really make this big program happen every year. And Tatiana, I don't know where you are, thank you for continuing to innovate the Economic Forum year after year and bringing it to this wonderful UCCS facility, the Inn Center for the Arts. Please allow me to recognize a couple of very special guests. I'd like to recognize our CU Regent, Kyle Hibble. Kyle, thank you for being here. And Regent Hibble has successfully completing the second term this year, and we owe you so much as a campus for everything you've done for us. And our Mayor, John Suthers, who's been always our champion and cheerleader. Mayor, thanks for being here. So I've finished a little over a year in the Chancellor's position, and I got to say, there's so much to be proud of. UCCS continues its trajectory with 12,600 students showing up this fall on our campus. But we also did a lot of things which I thought we'd slow down on building, but we didn't. We opened this magnificent building in February of 2018. We played our first game in the new baseball field, the Mountain Lion Park, in March 2018. Last month, in September, I actually ran the 200 meters with our track and field student athletes in the indoor practice facility on the opening day of the Mountain Lion Field House. If you haven't seen it, please do visit. And also last month, thanks to the support of Norwood Development, we opened the downtown presence last month. So we hope that to be a thriving place as UCCS connects with the community. We're also delighted to get funding from the state of Colorado to kick off our cybersecurity initiative into full gear and to assist our National Cybersecurity Center in town. We are going to bring new cyber faculty and staff with that funding, as well as grant scholarships to students. Our special thanks to Senator Kent Lambert, who led the charge to help us get that funding. Currently, we are seeking support phase to build out the cybersecurity building on Nevada. So please, either you or your friends could kind of spread the word on that, because we do want to build that cybersecurity building out. And right next to the Center for the Arts, we'll be opening the William J. Hibble Sport Medicine Performance Center in 2020. So we're going to start construction very soon on that one, and we're excited about that. As we are going through these exciting projects, the thing that makes me most happy is the many things our outstanding faculty, staff, our alumni, and community members are doing to help our students succeed. And we want to continue to do that, help our students stay in school, and help them graduate. And we'll also do this through several public-private partnerships, both with nonprofits and for-profits organizations. And so please look out for those wonderful students as they hit your companies as interns or graduates. We make almost a $600 million economic impact in this community, and we hope to continue that trajectory as we move forward. And the last thing I'm going to say, we are just starting out on our 2030 strategic plan so that we could carve our destiny as to what UCCS will look like in the next 10 years. And everything I see, we're going to have a bright future, and we look forward to your participation as we build out this campus. Again, thank you for your continued support and your friendship, and I look forward to continue to work with you, and please ask me how our campus is doing when I see you next time. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our Dean of the College of Business, Dr. Steve Ferris, who has wasted no time in connecting with the community. Please allow me to welcome Dr. Steve Ferris, the new Dean of the Business School. Thank you, Steve.
Well, good afternoon. And as the new Dean of the College of Business, I'm totally thrilled to welcome you to the 22nd Annual Economic Forum. UCCS and Colorado Springs business and civic communities have a long tradition of partnering. And I think that the Economic Forum you're going to attend today is an outstanding example of what partnership can actually bring. And we're very pleased to host this event in this wonderful new center for the arts. While I've only been part of UCCS for the past 4 months, it's very evident that the university is thriving, energetic, and growing. And it's only now beginning to realize its full potential. We achieved record enrollments this past fall with, as the Chancellor said, 12,600 students. To accommodate our growing student body, our campus continues to expand. Last month, we celebrated the opening of UCCS Downtown, a satellite facility designed to connect UCCS with the thriving civic and commercial communities of downtown Colorado Springs. With our new mini MBA program already underway at this new location, we look forward to many future programs and activities at our new downtown facility. The College of Business continues to reinforce its vision of building successful futures. Our vision would not be possible without the active endorsement of our many stakeholders. A few weeks ago, we hosted our largest career networking night with over 350 students and employers in attendance. This success was made possible because of the enthusiastic engagement of our sponsors, employers, and members of the Colorado Springs business community. The Daniel Fund's Ethic Initiative at UCCS now recognizes 47 educators as faculty fellows on the UCCS campus. They continue to champion principle-based ethics in Southern Colorado by serving 9 colleges and universities in our Southern Colorado Higher Education Consortium. Last month, we welcomed renowned speaker and motivator Stephen Covey to discuss speed of trust in our 2nd annual UCCS Ethics First event. Today, I anticipate a wonderful afternoon of timely and resourceful updates on national and local economic trends. And I want to thank Dr. Bailey for her 5th year of outstanding leadership as director of our forum. This forum would not be possible without the active sponsorship and participation of our many business partners. We thank them for their continual engagement and involvement. Not only do they support the forum financially, they also prize expertise and networking to help us generate and offer an outstanding program. So thank you.
And then last but not least, the fearless leader of Colorado Springs, Mayor John Suthers.
I'm not sure about fearless. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You know, I was thinking as I was driving out here what it must have been like to be a mayor driving to an economic forum in Colorado Springs 10 years ago in the depths of a recession, and contrasting that to the opportunity I have to come out on a day like today and talk about Colorado Springs when we're really experiencing such economic prosperity. Radically different, and I'm glad I'm the guy that's doing it now. A week ago, last Friday, I gave my annual State of the City address, and I spent a half an hour hitting all the high, not all, but some of the high points. That was a summary. So you can imagine I'm going to be moving really quickly here to touch on just a few of those in 5 minutes. I want to start by thanking Dr. Bailey for her invitation to participate and for all the program sponsors. And of course, my thanks to UCCS for once again sponsoring this event. Think about UCCS as an economic driver in our community. Not only this beautiful new venue, but so many other things that it's doing. It's really a fitting place for a discussion on the region's economy. As Dr. Reddy indicated, UCCS alone contributes up to $600 million in economic impact to the Colorado Springs area. Combined with our other educational institutions, higher educational institutions, Colorado College, $175 million annual impact. Pikes Peak Community College, $400 million economic impact, and the Air Force Academy, $1 billion annual impact. Folks, that's a total annual economic impact of almost $2.2 billion from our higher education institutions. And these institutions, of course, in addition to that economic impact, are educating over 40,000 students. And that's something that I, as a lifelong resident, like to think about a little bit. When I was born in Colorado Springs, there was about 40,000 people here. Now we have over 40,000 college students in Colorado Springs. Our local economy is very strong. And while a lot of our economic success over the last couple of years reflects an improving national economy, the fact of the matter is that our chamber and EDC, the city's Economic Development Office, and our governmental entities have been working hard to create an environment conducive to economic growth. The City Council, for example, eliminated the business personal property tax over a 2-year period. I personally believe that the amended annexation agreement for banning Lewis Ranch is absolutely vital to our economic future. Some of you may know that a small business survey, actual survey of small business owners done by thumbtack.com annually, we rated A+, the 4th highest rating of any major city in America for a small business environment. The job creation that has been achieved in the past 4 years in Colorado Springs is really remarkable. After 15 years of pretty stagnant job and wage growth. The fact of the matter is now profit and nonprofit organizations are moving here and expanding here. We've created 24,000 jobs since June of 2015, an average of 7,300 jobs per year. Boy, I hope those come close to Dr. Bailey's numbers. Wages have also begun to climb significantly, and this is amazing, and this is Dr. Bailey's number, with the median salary for posted jobs in the Pikes Peak region currently $77,000. That's slightly above Denver. When's the last time that happened? And far above the median salary for the state of Colorado. Where are those jobs? 1,500 registered nurse openings. 900 software engineers, cybersecurity positions. That's what's driving these high salaries. The real estate market also remains among the best in the country. Demand is high, new construction's at a record level, and homes are appreciating at a healthy rate. Yet, the fact of the matter is we remain among the most affordable of the most desirable places to live in America. The health of our commercial market is also evident by the new construction downtown and frankly throughout the city. New residential units and business growth are increasing the vitality of our downtown core with $750 million in new investments over the last couple of years. And think about the future. A year from now, the U.S. Olympic Museum and Hall of Fame will open, cementing our brand as Olympic City, USA. And as we announced in July, we're moving forward with the downtown stadium and sports center. And folks, that could not have happened without an incredible amount of private investment. CC stepping up to invest over $30 million in the downtown sports center. Widener apartment homes combining with the switchbacks to, in addition to the downtown stadium, do a residential and commercial complex around it. Our airport is continuing its resurgence with an anticipated 900,000 employments in 2018. That's up from 600,000 in 2015. Greg Phillips, our aviation director, is here. Folks, it's a tough job to grow the commercial airline service when you're 70 miles from the largest airport, one of the largest airports in the world. But we're making some progress. And go out to the airport and look at the new construction in the general aviation section. Sierra Nevada is now constructing yet another hangar. And after many years without much development in the business park to the south as you're driving into the airport, watch the next couple of years. I think you'll be truly amazed as that area takes off. It's estimated that there are 22 hotels or motels currently under construction or in the planning stage in El Paso County, an indication that our tourism industry is absolutely booming. And yet, despite all that construction, we have record occupancy rates in our hotels and motels. And of course, during 2018, we no longer have to engage in subjective self-assessments about our community. Colorado Springs was rated by leading news organizations that apply objective metrics to compare the most dynamic and economically prosperous cities in America. In doing that, U.S. News and Report rated Colorado Springs the second best place in America to live, 1/10 of a point behind Austin. We'll beat them next year. And the #1 most desirable city in America to live. Colorado Springs rated the highest of any city in quality of life, but also ranked very high in affordability, job creation, education, healthcare, and other economic criteria. And of course, folks, let's not forget all the help we've got from our citizens. A big contributing factor in achieving our current national status is the manner in which we have confronted in 3 short years a very large public infrastructure deficit. In 2015, voters in Colorado Springs passed Issue 2C, agreeing to invest in our roads with $250 million over 5 years. And in November of 2017, voters passed Issue 2A, agreeing to invest in our stormwater program, including reinstating a stormwater fee, which will allow us over the next 20 years not only to meet our legal obligations, but to create the best stormwater program in Colorado. And the huge bonus from that, general fund dollars freed up by the passage of that stormwater fee will allow us to hire 120 additional police officers and 32 additional firefighters by 2020. And these additional sworn personnel are absolutely essential to reducing critical incident response times and making our public safety capabilities among the best in the country. So, ladies and gentlemen, the bottom line fact is, as a result of unprecedented levels of public and private investment, Colorado Springs is taking its place among the great cities in America. And it's a great honor for me to be the mayor of this city at such an exciting time when we are continuing to build a city that matches our stupendous scenery. Thanks so much.
I was driving to an event yesterday evening on Colorado, pulling up on Nevada, and right there is the city admin building. And I have different friends in the admin building, so I always look at the corner of the hustle and bustle and who's there. And I'm in the left-hand turn lane about 5 cars back, and there's one person standing on the corner. And that one person at 6 o'clock was Mayor Suthers. And I couldn't help myself. I wanted to say something. And being a few cars back, roll down my window and I go, "Hey, Mayor Suthers." And he's, "Where'd that come from?" "You rock." And he just nods and then walks across the street. So before I welcome up our keynote speaker to the stage for the national and international economic outlook, I want to remind everyone to tweet in their questions that they have throughout our presentations and throughout the panel, because we will be answering those questions. This is an event really for all of you. So we want to make sure that we're covering the topics that you want to cover and dive into the topics that you want to dive into. When you're tweeting, be sure to use that hashtag Econ Forum, or to use any of the note cards that you can find around the venue. Without further ado, I'd like to invite up Tim Quinlan, Director and Senior Economist at Wells Fargo Securities.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it. Thanks very much. Thank you. Well, thank you, Sam, for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Bailey, for the invitation to be here. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us for the forum today. In my allotted time here, what I'd like to try to cover broadly is kind of an update on where we are in the tariff situation. That's kind of a top-of-mind consideration from a lot of the businesses and portfolio managers that we talk to. And then we'll describe more or less how Wells Fargo sees things playing out in the economy. And to follow up on Mayor Suthers' comments about not wanting to be in this spot 10 years ago, there's something to be said for just where we are in the duration of the cycle. And we'll kind of try to give you our read on how long we think that the good times will last. And then finally, we'll talk about how all of that fits into the broader context of the global economy. And there have been times throughout this economic expansion where the global economy has focused on, in the early years, worries about the sovereign debt situation in Europe, and then 3 or 4 years ago about the impact of the slowdown in China and the impact that that would have on broader emerging markets. And then maybe the past couple of years it was worries about oil and what lower oil prices at that time meant for the global economy. But really the United States at this point is kind of the real largest chunk of what's driving activity globally right now. So even if this were a purely global presentation for an international audience, we'd still end up spending a lot of our time talking about the U.S. So without any further ado, I'll kind of kick things off here, and I probably need to do something to turn this on to get it to receive it, or maybe there's a place I need to point it to make it work. But the first slide here has got our overall forecast on it, and it will give you some indication of one of the key driving factors is the development of technology and the ways that it can improve productivity. And Well, we're waiting to kind of sort that out. What I might say is, in terms of duration of the cycle, we at this point, so this now being October, this gets us to the 112th month of this current economic expansion. So if you ask yourself, how long do these things typically go? From the time you emerge from one recession until, from when the recovery first begins until the next recession comes along, since the end of World War II, the average is 56.4 months. So if you want to kind of round that up and call it 60 months, that'd be 5 years. And we are now in the 10th year of this expansion. So by any reckoning, it's late in the cycle. You know, the longest expansion we've ever had was 1991 to 2001. And as it turned out, that was exactly 120 months. And so at 112, we're already giving that a run for its money. And once I put this first slide up, you'll see an indication of where we see things in the next couple of years. And what you don't see is a recession forecast in. So I guess kind of the first major takeaway is, you know, just because it's late in the cycle doesn't compel you to have recession, or there's an old expression that economic expansions don't die of old age, and that's certainly true. So you look around for some things that are in excess, and so that'll be one of the themes as we kind of make our way through. Thank you so much. As we make our way through the deck here in terms of what some of those drivers are. Right. So here's a quote, and I'm going to try to. I can't completely steer clear of politics anymore. There was a time when in economics you could get away with that. That's more difficult to do these days. But I'll try to pitch it straight down the middle, and maybe you can come find me at the cocktail hour after and see if you could guess what side of the aisle I'm on, if any. But I quote here President Reagan in terms of something that he said about protectionist trade tariffs. And if you came in from Denver, you came in on the Ronald Reagan Highway, and the sentiment that's sort of conveyed in this quote really drove not just GOP orthodoxy, but really the kind of the global construct of both parties for the last 65 years or so, and basically saying the idea of declaring a trade war against our friends, you know, all while wrapping ourselves up in an American flag, is something we ought to be careful of. And that the expansion of the global economy, in Reagan's words, is not a foreign invasion, but American triumph, one that we worked really hard to create and foster. And so that it's, I guess maybe something I might underline in that is against our friends. And this isn't an anti-Chinese comment by any means, but I think that a reasonable case could be made that some of the protectionist trade policies that already exist in China, arguably, and your mileage may vary on this, but I think reasonable people can agree that if you have to, for example, forfeit your intellectual property rights to do business or distribute your product in that country, that can be sort of a restrictive policy. And I think there was scope for us to try to get them to engage in a more friendly manner. But broadly, it's difficult to find a group of economists who agree that erecting big protectionist trade tariffs is a good idea. There's another Reagan line that says if you put 3 economists in a room, you'll probably get at least 4 or 5 opinions on where the economy is headed. But one thing upon which they will all agree is that trade tariffs are a bad idea. And the National Association for Business Economics just conducted a survey about a month ago. 95% of business economists said that it's not really a great idea. And I suspect 5% of those misunderstood the question. Right, so there's a lot to kind of keep tabs with all this stuff, and I don't intend to go line by line through all of this stuff and drive you crazy with a specific accounting of each measure that's been put in place. But I think it's worthwhile to note that this has been going on since about November of last year with the softwood lumber tariffs, and then the washing machines and solar panels in February, then the steel and aluminum tariffs, and more recently we really significantly upped the ante with this $200 billion that just went into effect last week. that effectively tripled the size of all of the outstanding tariffs. And as you can see there are more that are under consideration, and the current administration has talked about increasing the tariff rate on the goods that are already in effect. So this could grow certainly soon. And I think sort of the conventional wisdom that you'll hear is that these trade tariffs are a means to an end. They're an effort to kind of influence trade policy in a broader sense, and cooler heads will eventually prevail, and they won't actually do that. And I maybe will present a bit of a counterculture read on it, which is I don't think that's true. I think, especially in terms of trade policy, anybody who thinks cooler heads are going to prevail has been wrong so far in this administration. So I think it's useful to measure what the impacts will be. And at the risk of sounding complacent here, in the next few slides, I'm going to sort of suggest that in the near term at least, it may not be all that disruptive, or perhaps a less dramatic way of saying it is that these tariffs alone will not bring the U.S. economy to its knees. And I'll kind of make my point here. So this is showing you steel and aluminum and iron and steel products all as a share of imports. And the broad takeaway here being that they comprise, over the last 20 years or so, about 4% of imports. And that may not be a large share, but if you're an industry that uses steel and aluminum products, well, it becomes awfully important to you. So if you're in the primary and fabricated metals business, it's a significant headwind for your business. It explains why Alcoa stock is down almost 40% from its April peak. Because if you're a main user of this stuff, it's a big problem. And that's true for machinery, electrical equipment, and appliance. In my role at Wells Fargo, I will talk to state manufacturing alliances. And boy, I'm really kind of walking a tightrope in those kinds of presentations, because half the room may benefit from the tariffs and half of the room may really be opposed to them. And I guess that's kind of an interesting thing here. When you run a list of industry codes and start highlighting the ones that are going to be subject to tariffs, what you're doing there is effectively picking winners and losers. So I'm not a huge fan of putting the government in the role to do that. So who are we targeting with steel and aluminum tariffs specifically? Well, Canada, China, and Mexico. You add those three together, and that gets you round numbers about half of all of the inputs that we draw our steel and aluminum from. And this comes at a time when manufacturers are telling us that they're seeing some of the highest input prices that they've experienced in the last 7 years or so. Now, admittedly, manufacturing profits are also at multi-year highs, so perhaps businesses are in a good position to sort of absorb that hit a little bit. When you look at those industries, so earlier we said what are industries that use a lot of steel and aluminum. Here we're looking at industries that have a lot of exposure to China. And what you've probably heard is, the number two one is what has drawn most of the attention here, or, the ag sector, which, admittedly is very big. Tomorrow morning, we'll get the latest trade figures, and the first line that I'm going to look at in that is going to be the line for soybeans, because soybeans really drove a big growth in exports in the second quarter as a lot of farmers rushed to get inventory out the door before the retaliatory tariffs began to bite. And now we've already seen 1 month of big declines in soybean exports. I'll be interested to see what happens this coming month. And for those of you who are tied to the ag sector, you probably already know this, but we're only now entering harvest season for soybeans. So September is the first main month. There's parts of Texas that begin harvesting soybeans in August. September is the first big month. October is the peak month nationally for soybean harvest. Now, by the time it gets to trade and going across the sea, it's not going over sitting in a pack of soy sauce like edamame. This has got to be dried and packed into containment bins and stuff, but it's going to begin to have a pretty big effect. The other category where you've seen a lot of this, though, is in the aerospace sector. We've seen 2 straight monthly declines in civilian aircraft export orders, and I'll be looking at that line tomorrow morning as well to see if we see more of that. Again, at the risk of sounding complacent here, who has the most to lose? Well, at least in terms of the bilateral trade relationship, China's really got a lot more to lose, They send about 20% of their exports to us. We send about 8% of our exports to them. So again, that's not to say that trade wars don't matter, or you can pick a fight with somebody if they've got more to lose. But those who say that China has more to lose in this, perhaps they have something of a point. I might counter that with the fact that Xi Jinping has a presidency for life, and I didn't check my Twitter feed before I came up here, but last I checked, we still have term limits here, and the ability of this administration to outlast that one in terms of a long-term trade war, I think time benefits the Chinese in that regard. So here what you're looking at is the blue bars basically represent all the other parts of economic growth. So inventory investment, consumer spending, business spending, government outlays, and then the brown bars there represent the contribution that you get from trade. And the broad point that I'm making here is only when you're kind of coming out of recession do you see periods where net exports is really a major driver. There's that big boost that we had in the second quarter, which I think is going to more than reverse in the third quarter. In other words, if it was a 1.2 percentage point boost in Q2, I expect it to be at least 1.3% drag in Q3. So I guess what I'm saying there is that net exports is often the least consequential factor if you think of the old formula for GDP growth. So that's sort of the high-level stuff here on tariffs, but I would be remiss. I knew I was going to be in front of an intelligent and academic audience today, and so I thought I better do more than just bring a quote from Ronald Reagan. And so I found some deep research, and one of the great thinkers on tariffs, of course, is the economics professor Ben Stein from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And you might think that I've made up this or used it to fit my presentation, but this is actually, you can look it up on YouTube, this is exactly what he was talking about when the whole classroom of kids was falling asleep, and he kept saying, anyone, anyone? But he was talking about the Smoot-Hawley trade tariffs and their attempts to get us out of the Great Depression. And did it work? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. So I'm not a huge fan. I don't think it's going to completely derail the expansion over the next couple of years. I do think it's the sort of thing that can cause, that can cast a really long shadow. In other words, Wells Fargo helps businesses find when they want to grow overseas. We help them find correspondent banking relationships in those countries, and retailers and distribution networks. And it takes a very, very long time to build the relationships and build the trust to do those sorts of things. And when you have these really disruptive things, and it seems like capricious choices from a head of state, it can sort of destabilize people's confidence in those long-term relationships. And I worry that even if all of this trade stuff goes away tomorrow, we'll still be kind of seeing a downward pressure on exports over a long time because of some of those changes. Okay. So you survived the first chunk of this. We'll transition now to where we see things kind of headed from here. And as I referred to in my introduction, we're not, these lines would have to be going negative. Wherever you see these columns, this indicates a recession period, and we're effectively sticking our neck out here a little bit. We're basically saying that you're now living through the longest uninterrupted expansion in history. And I think that a case could be made that part of the ability of this thing to go so long is the fact that it was just so agonizingly slow for so many years. And perhaps that augurs well for a longer duration. It wasn't a V-shaped bottom. It was kind of this much more gradual. It took us a long time to get back to the pre-recession peak, and by that reckoning, perhaps we've got some more room to run here. So the further you go out the forecast, though, so here's these blue bars indicate Wells Fargo. So if you want to take what I say with a grain of salt and say, well, what is the consensus saying? We're slightly above consensus next year, about in line with it for 2020. The dark bars here indicate the Congressional Budget Office and their forecast. And as you can see here, we're all kind of clustered around 3% this year and next year. The very last lines there in the color red to match his tie is the president's own forecast. And as you might notice, he has embraced a somewhat rosier outlook in further years out. And part of that is you need those kind of growth numbers to make some of the budget assumptions in his budget work. And so why then do all these egghead economists like me and my colleagues say that you've kind of got a speed limit of around 2%, whereas the president thinks we can do 3% on an uninterrupted basis? Maybe we're the problem. Maybe we need to just get on board and adopt a different attitude. Well, we talked before about that formula, C plus I plus G plus N. When you do a long-range forecast, you go out, when you stop saying, well, here's where we're going to be next year or the year after, where we are in this cycle, but rather you say, where will we be 10, 15 years from now? You tend to look at different drivers. You look at labor force growth, capital spending, and total factor productivity growth. And let's just take a second to see how those have emerged over the last 65 years or so. So here's where we were in the 50s and the 60s, and you can kind of see there's sort of a long-run trend here that's going a little bit down. And I'm not putting this on here to be a downer on things by any means, but these factors aren't what they used to be. Labor force growth, for example, had its heyday kind of in the 1970s. That's when you had baby boomers becoming, working age, and female participation in the labor force ramping up. It's still increasing again at this point in the cycle, but it never increased as much as it did in those years as women began to really enter the workforce in greater numbers. And then that's kind of tapered off more recently. We don't have a ton of growth there anymore. Now, the good news is for a big developed economy, we have some growth. If you were to compare us to Japan or Western Europe or other big advanced economies of the world, the fact that these bars are still on the positive side during the forecast period is good news. But we're just, we're not growing the labor force the way we used to. And that's everybody's fault collectively. I bear responsibility. I'm one of 6 kids. I only have 3 future labor units of my own. And Mrs. Quinlan has asked me not to refer to them that way, but that's the truth of it. And you look at some of these other factors like capital spending. Well, capital spending had its heyday in the 90s. That was the internet and tech revolution, and that was great. My first job was in the late 1990s, and I basically answered the phone for a big financial firm, and we would mail out to people, and I kid you not, Y2K survival kits in those years. And people were glad to have them too. Lots of really great details in there about saving your water and food supply. This isn't a Wells Fargo projection, but rather a projection from I'll just say CBO from now on. That's Congressional Budget Office. So the CBO's projection for the next 10 years, they're basically saying you add up labor plus capital plus total factor productivity, and that gets you to round numbers 2%, and where's the rest of it going to come from? Now, you can take measures to spur labor force growth, right? You can do tax incentives to encourage bigger families, and that's great, but that's going to have an 18-year lag. You could liberalize immigration policy. How do I say this diplomatically? That seems unlikely in the current political climate. So you're a little bit stuck with some of these factors. Now, what about boosting capital spending? Here's where we've been with capital spending. We had kind of these bummer years here for a while, and then a big surge. But some of this occurred before the election. So, why the surge, and how come we don't think it's going to last? Well, when you look at the role of energy only comprises 5, 6, 7%, depending on where you are in the cycle, of overall capital spending. But in this most recent cycle, it drove all of the growth from the time that we emerged from recession in 2009 until oil prices peaked in 2014. And then oil prices fell out of bed, and you could see what kind of happened there. And so you had this situation in 2015 or so, 2016, where people were saying, my gosh, manufacturing's in recession. Look, here's the other recession, here's the other. If this line's below 0, it must be that manufacturing's in recession. And we sort of pointed out at the time, gosh, if you strip away the mining sector, it's really only slowed. It hasn't gone into outright decline. And so this bounce back in energy prices has been broadly supportive of capital spending growth, and that's really kind of underpinned decent capital spending. Now, what about the tax cuts, right? Hey, tax cuts are rocket fuel for the economy, I keep hearing in the news. And that's absolutely true. When you look at corporate profits, you cannot argue that the tax cuts have not been good for the US business sector. But is it making them spend more? Are business executives more inclined to engage in capital spending activity because their after-tax profits are higher or because their taxes have been cut? Well, helpfully, the Federal Reserve actually went and asked them. They, using help from Stanford and the University of Chicago, they conducted this survey of business executives around the country. They asked them a question in November and then again in February, basically the same thing, which is, hey, if this tax cut goes through, or based on this tax cut that just went through, how inclined are you to increase your capital spending? Now, I could see some of you are already getting ahead of me on this, but in November, you had, round numbers, 34% or so say, yeah, please, cut my taxes. I will definitely start spending more on CapEx. Please, just give me that nice tax cut. And then once the tax cut went through, that number dropped to about 24%. 75% of business owners say they're not actually all that inclined to increase capital spending, and 1%, just to be spiteful, said they're going to cut their CapEx plans, so they got a tax cut. So I'm not convinced that that's going to kind of get you there. What it does get you in the meantime is these assumptions now that the Congressional Budget Office makes about where the debt is going. Now, Dr. Bailey asked me to keep things kind of upbeat today, and I don't want to get too down in the dumps on some of this stuff, but if I've got a scary chart in the deck, it's this one, okay? Both of these charts give you 42 years of history, and I need to fix the one on the right because it doesn't have recession bars in it, but you can see the recession bars in the one on the left. And what you're looking at here is not in dollars, but as a share of GDP, what the federal budget or surplus deficit is. So how are we doing? And this is not the national debt. This is just how much are we bringing in terms of tax receipts and how much are we spending in terms of government spending programs. And the point of my chart is during recession periods, you have a tendency to expand budget deficits. Well, that makes sense. You're not getting as much in tax receipts. You got more people that qualify for Medicaid and other government programs. Governments often run deficits during recessions. Well, then an expansion comes along and we have a tendency to narrow the budget deficit. Recession, expand. Here's the only other expansion we've ever had that lasted this long. And not only did we narrow the budget deficit, my goodness, we had a budget surplus by the last few years of it. And so then the next cycle comes along, yep, we slip into big deficits, we narrow them, huge recession comes along, and now we get the Tea Party. People look around and say, are you kidding me? 10% is a share of GDP? $1.4 trillion in debt, not national debt, but just the ongoing budget deficit. Throw these bums out and bring somebody in who can balance the damn budget. And you had some, the expansion went along, we were narrowing the budget deficit, and if you were looking at this in 2015, you might have done a poor man's trend line and said, my goodness, by 2018, we'll have a balanced budget. But owing to a lot of different factors, not the least of which, though, is the fact that we're not taking in as much in government revenues because of the tax cuts, you've now got bigger budget deficits. Now, I'm not laying that all at the feet of the tax cuts. It also has to do with just demographics and baby boomers gradually shifting into the years that they're withdrawing from Social Security instead of contributing to it, and other committed expenses that we have. That are driving the cost of running the government higher. But if you want this line to narrow, if you want to get closer to a balanced budget, you either need more government revenue or less government spending. And candidly, I don't care which one you do. I just wish you'd pick one and do it so that we could have balanced budgets. This, of course, comes at a backdrop of a booming economy. And what the left-hand chart is telling you is that consumers are carrying less debt. The chart on the right-hand side is, their cost of financing that debt is beginning to rise a little bit as the Fed is guiding interest rates a little bit higher as they did just recently. But the takeaway here is it's still about as low. Financing costs for households are about as low as they've been since the early 1990s. And consumers feel great. Consumer confidence. This data, the chart only goes back to 1987, but the data goes back to 1967. And in all those years that the Conference Board has been keeping tabs on consumer confidence, there have only been 11 individual months when consumer confidence is higher than it is today. Now, if you kind of circle those other periods where consumer confidence is just uproariously high, it's kind of the thin air of the high peaks that we're in here today at 138.4. 98% of all observations are lower than they are today. So forgive me if I check to see if we've got a nosebleed at these levels, because they're awfully high. But I'd be crazy to bet against the consumer when confidence is as strong as it currently is. So we've got consumer confidence growing. It kind of comes off the boil as this expansion gets longer in the tooth and later in the cycle. Residential construction activity is kind of about the only soft spot in the economy right now. Things are not, all these other statistics that just seem to be breaking new records and all-time highs. The housing market seems to be kind of hitting a little bit of a soft patch here. We still think that there's scope for it to grind gradually higher from here. If you look at what a limited supply of existing homes there are, particularly in markets like Colorado Springs, I suspect you'll hear more about that later, but the month's supply of existing homes is so scant that there's scope for for home builders to build more homes to kind of offset some of the scarcity of supply. Also, the home ownership rate, and again, this is kind of a politically charged one here, and I don't want to step in anything, but I think we can all agree that in 2005, the home ownership rate was too high, and in 2015, 16, it was too low. I think, we're still about at levels that we've last seen in the early 1990s. There's scope for this to go a little bit higher. Why do you get the bounce there, by the way? How long does a bankruptcy stay on your credit record? What happened 7 years before, late 2015, early 2016. So I think that there's scope there for that to kind of help a little bit. All right, so you survived the first two pieces. So now we kind of, well, I guess we've got a little bit on the rates side of things. So the Federal Reserve raised rates recently. Now we're just a little north of 2%. And what they're basically saying is, yeah, we've got it at 2.25 now, and by the end of 2019, some of us think it could be as high as 3.5%. Some of us think we'll be lucky to get another rate hike in. But if you go with the guy in the middle, the median one, we're talking 3.25. But if you ask us what the long-run stable rate for Fed funds ought to be, probably around 3% or so. So it kind of depends. Are you a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of gal? If you look at this and say, oh my gosh, well, if we're at 2.25 now and it's not going to go any higher than 3 or 3.25, we've only got 1% to go higher in interest rates. That's not all that bad. If you're a CFO, you might say, yeah, well, if it goes from 2 to 3, that's a 50% increase, and that means my financing costs are going up quite a bit. So there could be some impacts there. The Fed's got two jobs, as most of you probably know, maximum employment and low and stable inflation. So how are we doing on that front? Well, the unemployment rate is below levels where the Fed has raised rates in prior cycles. I don't have a better place to be. I'm just seeing how I'm doing on time. And if it drops much lower from here, we're about matching 2000 lows. If it goes much lower from here, it'll be its lowest level since the 1960s. Now, you could say, but labor participation and because of a lack of participation, the unemployment rate overstates the health of the labor market. Okay, all right, that's fair, and I recognize that that's true. But by any reckoning, the labor market is absolutely white hot right now. On the left-hand side is job openings. And for the last 12 months in a row, every time this number prints, it breaks my graph. And I've got to change the scale on it. Because this chart used to stop at 5.5. Then I had to stop it at 6, then 6.5. Our latest print here was 6.94 million jobs. We have never had more job openings than we do today. White hot labor market. So the next time your husband or wife tells you about how your brother-in-law still can't find work, show them that chart. Give me a break. And then, quits. Boy, if you were brought up in my house, Buster, you never quit at anything. But today, friends, let's hear it for the quitters, because the quits rate has never been higher either. And this has been the question of questions for everybody is, what happened to the Phillips curve? How come low unemployment isn't leading to higher inflation? That was the big focus of Jackson Hole last summer. Monetary policy makers from all over the world got together and, stroked their chins and thought and, tried to come up with answers for it. And, maybe I'm just a kind of a blue-collar economist here, but I say if I'm a business, why the hell should I pay people more if they're content with what they've got? And after the scariness of this and the recession, it took a long, long time before the quits rate to get back up to anything near a normal level. And so now that quits is as high as it currently is, I think we need to all brace for much higher wage growth coming our way. You probably saw the announcement from Amazon earlier this week, but wage growth only at about 2.7% nationwide. You know, I guess we should be excited about that because it's about as fast as we've seen in this cycle. But my goodness, does anybody remember the 1990s? The slowest rate of wage growth in the 90s was 3.5%. You know, so how can we be late cycle dynamics, low unemployment rate, booming economy, and where are the wages here? And I think we're poised to see this one. If you want me to take kind of a out of consensus view, this is one area that I think we really need to look out for is much higher wages in the near term. Charlie Evans, the Chicago Fed president, gave a talk at the Bank of Japan recently, and he said, you know, in this expansion in the United States, we say that we have a 2% target for inflation, but in practice, it's more been a 2% ceiling. Every time we get close to 2%, something falls out underneath it, and you know, fundamentals no longer support it. Well, I think we're finally at a point where fundamentals will continue to support that 2% growth, barring, you know, some major change in the near term or oil prices dropping back down to $40 a barrel. I think that we're seeing all kinds of indications of tightening in the supply chains, tightening in the labor markets, and that'll likely transfer into higher interest rates. What does all this mean for the Fed? Higher interest rates. How much higher? Well, we're getting a little bit cute here, and I think the best way to think of it is to look at these charts. And the brown line here is our best idea of where interest rates will be at the end of this year. And then the blue line is where they'll be at the end of 2019. And this is what I mean where we're getting a little bit smart here is we're saying that 2020, we're essentially saying they're going to overdo it. They're going to raise rates a little too aggressively and have to take one of them back in 2020. And you might have noticed earlier, we talked about how the pace of growth trails off further out in the forecast period. Well, in an effort to ameliorate some of that slowing, you know, we think the Fed will probably take back one of those, as I said, and maybe describe it as an insurance cut to kind of help, you know, prolong the expansion at that point. I don't have a ton of time to go deeply into this, but you know, the yield curve is not a perfect indicator of when recessions are coming. Yes, it did lead each of the past recessions, but it did not invert before the 54 to 65 period, and it missed two other recessions. It also, in 1966, 1986, and 1998, gave us head fakes, where it said a recession was coming and you didn't get it. So, like another joke about economists, this guy predicted 7 out of the last 5 recessions. Well, you can make the same joke about the yield curve. I think the Fed's balance sheet is likely to become a bigger focus as the Fed gets rates to what they call their long-run normal of 3%. Well, then it'll be talking about the shape of the yield curve. And long story short, the Fed is going to go from being a net buyer of U.S. Treasuries to a net seller of Treasuries. And if you think of that in the context of this budget situation, which we talked about before, you know, the CBO says that by 2020, which is just the year after next, we're going to be running $1 trillion budget deficits. $1 trillion budget deficits. Last fiscal year, our budget deficit was $665 billion, so we need more than $300 billion of new debt issuance. So the Treasury's got to step up into the marketplace and say, I got $300 billion here in Treasuries, who wants to buy it? And that's going to happen at the same time as the Federal Reserve is going to be walking out saying, folks, we're no longer buying Treasuries. In fact, we'd like to get rid of some of the ones we've got on our own balance sheets. That's part of the reason why we see longer-term interest rates continuing to rise throughout the forecast period. So this is the kind of accountability slide, which explains why the font is so small. But this more or less gives you an idea of where we see things going. Like I said, between 2.5% and 3% the next couple of years before kind of gradually tapering off to, I'm calling it 2.2 for the year 2020. But if you want to think of it a different way, just that almost as though there's a governor on the speed of the U.S. economy further out that kicks in somewhere around 2% or so. I think that's our potential growth rate in the long run. So how does all this fit into the broader global economy? Well, here's your long-term average for global GDP growth. And maybe we've been punching just slightly above it in the last year. We could keep that up maybe 1 or 2 more years. And then we kind of return to a long-run normal. What's the risk here? Well, certainly if these trade disputes turn into actual full-blown trade war, why then we might expect to see bigger disruptions here. And so if you look at global export volume, which tends to run a little bit more currently than global GDP data. We have this, for example, through July, which is pretty contemporary for global figures, and it's kind of come back up a little bit. That was a relief to me because as of June, as you can see, it had kind of dipped a little bit lower there. So it's sort of getting back toward its long-run average, but this is what I'll be looking at as a leading indicator for disruptions that might come from trade. This is kind of how things play out on the kind of top trading partners of the United States and what we see for growth in a number of those economies and inflation dynamics there as well. And that concludes my formal remarks. I think that I've got a question and answer period that lasts maybe, I think, is it 15 minutes that we've got slotted for that? So I'd be very delighted to answer whatever's on your mind. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.